Have you ever felt that the loudest noise isn't around you, but inside your own mind? It's interesting how, in a world full of distractions, true silence can feel scarier than any sound. But silence holds a secret that few people realize. It has the power to transform your life in ways you'd never expect. This Buddhist story shows how the simple act of being silent, something so undervalued today, can be the key to deep transformation. You might think you already understand silence, but are you truly ready to discover its real power? Get ready, because what you learn today could completely change how you live and manage your thoughts. There was a disciple in a Buddhist monastery who carried the weight of his words wherever he went. Talking was his way of existing, of asserting his place in the world, and in some ways, he believed it was a virtue. He didn't just chat with the other disciples, he also indulged in gossip, passing stories from one person to another, always feeling a bit smarter for doing so. He saw himself as someone special, someone who had left the comforts of the outside world to dive deep into the search for truth. With each word he spoke, his sense of superiority grew. What he didn't realize, however, was that instead of moving toward the truth, he was drifting further away with every piece of gossip and every judgment he made. This disciple truly believed he was above the others because of what he had sacrificed. In his mind, renouncing the comforts of secular life made him special, as if it were the ultimate sacrifice. But he didn't yet understand that the real journey wasn't physical, it was mental. How often do we fall into the same trap, thinking that because we've faced challenges or overcome hardships, we're somehow superior? In reality, the real challenge is about bettering ourselves from the inside out, not just on the surface. True inner transformation is subtle yet powerful, and it can't be measured by visible suffering. In his mind, he talked so much because he wanted to be understood, to stand out. But deep down, he was haunted by the fear of silence. Silence felt like a threat to his identity, a void he filled with words. Many people feel the need to constantly say something, believing their worth comes from how much they speak. But true value doesn't come from words. It's in what we hear and understand when we're quiet. For the disciple, silence was a mirror, and he wasn't ready to face his own reflection yet. The guru, with his sharp wisdom, kept a close eye on all his disciples. The talkative disciple, who thought he was special because of his sacrifices, stood out because of his constant need for attention. So, when the guru suggested that each disciple take on a resolution for the month, he knew the talkative one would aim for something grand. And that's exactly what happened. Eager to choose a challenge that would elevate his status in front of the others, the disciple asked for something that, in his eyes, would be difficult enough to prove his strength and determination. The guru, with a knowing smile, simply instructed him to remain silent for a month. The disciple was surprised by how simple the task seemed, and without understanding the real challenge behind it, he eagerly accepted. At first, the disciple saw silence as just a physical challenge. Not talking for a month seemed easy enough. After all, it's just about keeping your mouth shut, right? But little did he know, he was about to embark on a much deeper journey. In the first few days, he remained confident, even feeling a bit superior for handling the task without much trouble. But gradually, he began to realize that the real challenge wasn't in not speaking, it was in managing the weight of silence. His mind, once filled with words and gossip, was now exposed to his own thoughts. And like many of us, when we finally stop and embrace silence, we confront that uncomfortable internal noise that doesn't fade so easily. The guru knew exactly what he was doing. Self-improvement is about more than just controlling outward behavior. It requires deep inner work and mastering oneself. For the disciple, outer silence was only the first layer of the challenge. It's similar to when we decide to make a change in our lives, thinking the biggest obstacles will come from the outside world. But in reality, the toughest struggles often happen within. The disciple, eager to prove something, found himself in a test that forced him to look inward, where no words could hide what was really there. At first, the talkative disciple believed that silence would be easy to manage, but as time passed, he realized that not speaking was only a small part of the challenge. The real weight came from confronting the noise in his own mind. Each day of external silence amplified his inner restlessness, and what once seemed like a simple task became a battle with himself. He started to feel overwhelmed by the silence, as if the absence of words was revealing everything he had been trying to avoid. The disciple began to feel unwell, not physically, but emotionally. The outer silence created inner tension, making him impatient and frustrated. The voices in his head grew louder, and he realized that the hardest part wasn't keeping his mouth shut, but quieting his mind. The simple act of staying silent became a mirror for his fears, doubts, and anxieties, things he had never confronted before. This reminds us that, often when we seek self-improvement, it's not the external world holding us back, it's the internal battles that weigh us down. As time went on, the disciple felt like he was losing control. The lack of words made him feel isolated, not from others, but from himself. He began to understand that the real challenge was not the physical act of silence, but the internal struggle. Many of us believe we can control our lives by changing what's around us, but silence teaches that true control comes from within. Slowly, the disciple started to realize that in order to find peace, he first had to master his mind. In the early days, the disciple stuck to his resolution, thinking that staying silent was just a matter of discipline. But as the days dragged on, he realized that silence was much deeper than he had thought. Without speaking, he faced a new reality. His mind wouldn't stop. His thoughts kept spinning, and the internal noise became almost unbearable. It was as if the words he used to speak were now echoing endlessly inside his head. Just like many of us, who think that being quiet on the outside is enough for inner peace, he started to understand that the real challenge was gaining control over his thoughts. As the silence continued, the disciple began to feel the effects of this inner battle on both his body and spirit. He didn't know how to handle the flood of thoughts tormenting him, and it started to take an emotional toll. He felt an increasing pressure, as if every minute of silence was testing his mental endurance. His mood shifted constantly, and the energy he once spent on gossip and empty conversations was now directed toward fighting against himself. This inner struggle is something many people face when trying to improve their lives. At first, it seems like making external changes, like not talking or avoiding distractions, will be enough. But we soon realize that to truly grow, we must face the inner storms we carry within. As the days of silence stretched on, the disciple's mind grew more restless than ever. The silence, which he once saw as an ally, now felt like an enemy. He felt as though he was losing control, not just over his speech, but over himself. It seemed that the act of not speaking was bringing out all his insecurities and fears, which he had once masked with words. Many of us can relate to this. When we're left alone with our thoughts, we realize just how much external noise serves as a comforting distraction. But true transformation begins when we confront what's inside, and the disciple was starting to understand that this was his real journey. Overwhelmed by the weight of silence, the disciple couldn't bear the discomfort building within him. He had once thought the challenge would be purely physical, but now found himself stuck in a mental battle that seemed never-ending. Desperate and unsure of how to cope with this inner conflict, he approached the guru, hoping for a quick fix, something to relieve him of this invisible burden. The guru, with his calm wisdom, listened patiently and, with a serene smile, said, "True silence isn't about not speaking. It's about quieting the mind." Those simple words opened up a new perspective for the disciple. For the first time, he realized that the silence he feared wasn't external, it was within. Still confused, the disciple began reflecting on the guru's words. He understood that outer silence didn't necessarily mean inner peace. As the guru had pointed out, the real challenge was learning to manage the internal noise. How often do we face the same reality? We think distancing ourselves from external distractions will bring peace, but we forget that our minds are a constant source of thoughts and noise. Self-improvement requires embarking on this inner journey, where mastering our thoughts becomes key. The disciple realized that the noise he had been trying to escape wasn't in the voices of others, it was within his own mind. Determined to find the peace he sought, the disciple began practicing meditation. The guru had shown him the way, but it was up to him to walk the path. Every day, he sat in silence, not trying to force his thoughts away, but simply observing them. At first, it was incredibly difficult. His thoughts came in waves, sometimes so overwhelming he felt as though he might drown in them. But gradually, he noticed something. The thoughts came, but they also went. He didn't need to hold on to them. The peace he had been seeking wasn't about controlling his mind. It was about letting it run its course without resistance. Just as the wind blows and the leaves dance, thoughts come and go, and true freedom lies in allowing that to happen without interference. After receiving his guru's advice, the disciple decided to completely remove himself from external distractions. He went to the forest, believing that the silence of nature would finally bring him the peace he longed for. Surrounded by trees and the soft sound of the wind, he expected the noise in his mind to fade. But once he was alone, he realized that outer silence didn't ease the inner chaos. In fact, the lack of outside noise only amplified the noise inside. The voices in his head, his worries and repetitive thoughts grew louder. The disciple spent days wrestling with this mental battle, trying to understand why isolation wasn't working the way he expected. He had believed that physical solitude would bring him peace, but he began to understand that true silence isn't about your surroundings. And that's a common misconception. How often do we think that getting away from the chaos of the world will bring us the peace we're searching for? So many believe that traveling to a remote place or disconnecting from social media is the key to mental rest, only to find that the most disturbing noise comes from within. To truly improve yourself, you must understand that outer silence is just the first step. The real challenge lies in calming your mind. As the weeks went by, something began to shift. The disciple, exhausted from battling his thoughts, decided to let them flow naturally. He stopped trying to force silence, stopped resisting. It was at that moment he began to understand the true nature of silence. It wasn't about the absence of sound. It was about accepting the thoughts without trying to control them. Gradually, the mental noise started to fade. He no longer felt the pressure to quiet his mind. Instead, he let it be, watching his thoughts pass by, like leaves carried by the wind. In this surrender, he finally found true silence, a deep inner calm that nothing external could provide. The disciple realized that the secret to silence, ironically, was not enforcing it. After months of deep isolation, the disciple returned to the monastery, but he was no longer the same person. The man who had left with an air of superiority and a constant need to stand out now carried an inner peace that showed in everything he did. He no longer needed to speak to be noticed or to feel superior to validate his existence. His steps were calm, and his once restless gaze now radiated serenity. The silence that had once seemed like a punishment had become his refuge. He had come to understand something that many never realize. True power doesn't come from speaking louder or being noticed, but from mastering oneself through silence. When he re-entered the monastery, the other disciples immediately noticed the difference. The once talkative disciple, who always sought to be the center of attention, now observed the world with a contagious calm. He no longer felt the need to dominate conversations or prove his superiority. Instead, he had become the embodiment of the silence he had cultivated in solitude. His interactions were few but full of meaning. He no longer used words to impress. This kind of transformation is rare but powerful, reminding us that the most profound internal changes often reveal themselves through the smallest external actions. Over time, the other disciples noticed that while the once talkative disciple had become quieter, his wisdom had deepened. He spoke less, but when he did, his words carried a weight they never had before. His teachings now came from a place of personal experience, from an inner silence that allowed him to see beyond the surface. He no longer sought approval from others because he had already found peace within himself. His spiritual journey, which had begun with a desire to be better than others, ended with a deep understanding that true wisdom comes from finding silence within, even when the world around you is noisy. Now that you understand the power of silence, the question is, are you ready to take the next step? How many times have you searched for answers outside when the silence and peace you seek are already inside you? Maybe it's time to stop fighting your own thoughts and start learning how to observe them. The silence that transformed the disciples' life can transform yours too. Are you ready for that? Are you prepared to apply this wisdom to your daily life and watch the change unfold? If this story resonated with you, be sure to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you can continue exploring topics that can elevate your life. And don't miss our latest video, The Magic Inside You. Discover how to activate your magical energy now. An opportunity to dive even deeper into your journey of transformation.